Hello everyone. Tonight we will pass through slowly creaking gates, entering ancient homes where rings did not come in small boxes, but in sacks of flour, fruit trees, or even braided strands of hair. Imagine getting married and, as a symbol of love, receiving a pregnant goat, or an ancestral mattress where generations slept and cried. Today this may sound strange, but in ancient times, dowry spoke louder than vows. They were the true contract, the silent foundation on which their life was built. More than possession, these gifts said everything about what was expected of a wedding. And sometimes what was given was heavier than the commitment itself. Let's explore the most unusual, and poetic gifts that have served as currency in past unions. Some were given with affection, others with obligation, but they all carried stories that the dust did not erase. In every corner of the world, from cold villages in the north to sunny villages among olive trees, what was given along with the bride was not just a good thing. It was an omen, a pact, a hope wrapped in silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me, where are you right now and what time is it there? I like to imagine this invisible map of tired souls, about to fall asleep, listening to soft stories in the distance. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. In the shadows of a medieval village, where the sound of bells marked the time and the windows were molded in damp wood, getting married was also a pact with the land. There was more dust than gold, more chickens than fine fabric, and yet marriages carried an invisible value. It was common for the dowry to be a tree, a small seedling, sometimes newly transplanted, rooted in a bucket of fresh clay. That wasn't just a plant. It was a promise of fruits, of shadow, of continuity. The tree would grow along with the lives of the bride and groom, and perhaps one day its trunk would serve as a swing for unborn children. At that time, fertility was observed in everything that breathed. A healthy goat indicated that the woman would also be fertile. A well-kept orchard revealed that the man knew how to take care of his wife. The metaphors were not just poetic, they were real, like the calloused hands that plowed the field and the attentive eyes of mothers who, before approving the groom, examined the chickens he brought. The harvest anticipated the womb. If the flowers took root, the crops would not be long in coming. It was a time when love sprouted slowly, like the season, but the anxiety existed. It was an uneasy silence in the nights leading up to the wedding. The bride, sitting at the foot of the bed, looked at the dowry as if looking at an oracle. Would that be enough? Would the soil in the new house accept its roots? And the husband, would you have hands to plant or just to harvest? Marriages like this were not guaranteed. They had hope, and a hope measured in bushels, twigs, and shreds of wool. There was always the risk of a plague or a longer winter, and the dowry, however symbolic, was also emotional insurance against the unpredictable. The father-in-law, on the other hand, rarely smiled. He squinted his eyes as if he were examining the soul through the earth. The appearance of the tree was not enough. Its strength had to be proven. Sometimes he would plant it even before the wedding, and he would wait. If it grew, the groom was approved. If it withered, the marriage would be reconsidered. This dance between man, nature, and feelings formed the rhythm of the village. It was an ancient wisdom, transmitted through gestures and silences, and even without saying a word, everyone knew what was expected of that orchard. Today, when we talk about inheritance, we think of wills and deeds. But at that time, inheritance was what could be touched with love. A fig tree sapling given by his grandmother, a pair of goats named by his mother, a piece of land where the groom had already planted onions. All this was more than property. It was an effective lineage, a way of saying, I give you what made me survive, and I ask you to survive too. The value was not in the object, but in the care with which it had been maintained, and hoping it would last beyond the next season. Some goats were so old that they had already seen other brides leave. They were part of the family, and yet they were delivered with teary eyes and whispered blessing, because that simple gesture of giving an animal, a seed, a corner of the garden was the equivalent of today's yes. It was the most honest way to say, I accept you, with branches and hooves, with the smell of a barnyard and hands dirty with earth. And this silent honesty was perhaps what most sustained marriages at that time. And when everything bloomed, when the first figs appeared, when the goat gave milk and the children were born strong, there was a kind of shy but full joy. There were no fireworks, no long parties, but there was fresh bread for breakfast, and eyes that met without haste while the sun rose behind the orchard. A dowry that germinates is more than a gift. It is poetry in its restate. And even if time erases the names of the bride and groom, the tree, perhaps, still grow silently, telling the story of a love planted. There were homes where the dowry did not come in coins or goats, but in promises whispered behind closed doors. Silence was the most valuable gift, and also the cruelest. In many families, especially those with more daughters than land, a different destiny was laid out for some. Instead of a veil, they wore the dark veils of the convent. Instead of a party, there were silent ceremonies before a cold stone altar. And the girl, not knowing exactly what it meant to be promised to God, found herself wrapped in words she had not chosen. It was the invisible dowry, the absence of choice wrapped in prayers. Families did not speak about it with pain. They spoke strategically. It was one less mouth to feed, a less fragmented inheritance, an honor preserved. But in the girl's heart, there were questions that no one answered. She had not asked for silence, but she was silenced. And within the bars of the convent, where voices echoed like wind through stained glass, her story ceased to be told. There, what was offered was not a tree, a bed, or a bag of salt. It was their own daughter, dressed in a habit, marked by a decision that was not hers. The smell was always the same, candle wax and incense, mixed with the dust of centuries accumulated between the wooden benches and the stone corridor. The sound was muffled. Latin chants floated on hurriedly, touching the shoulders and eyelids of the inmate. Some seemed at peace, others merely resigned. There was a kind of beauty there, but it was the beauty of confinement, the beauty that only exists when one learns not to desire. Each lit candle was a reminder that the world outside was still in motion, but here inside, everything was static. Being a woman, in that context, sometimes meant giving oneself completely without being asked. It meant disappearing delicately, becoming a shadow in the name of family honor. There was no revolt in the eyes of those who went through the vow ceremony. There was silence, and that silence said more than any scream. It said yes. Even if the heart said no, it said renunciation, when the body had not yet known the touch of love. And that kind of dowry, which was unseen, weighed more than any bag of coins. Some mothers cried, others hardened their faces. They knew what this meant. They knew that they might never see their daughter smiling freely again. But they told themselves that it was for the best, that religious life was safe, and that their daughter, although silent, would be protected. It was a comforting story for those who needed to sleep in peace. And inside the convent, each new name given to the new sisters erased a piece of the name they had once carried outside. They were forced rebirths, and not always happy ones. At night, when the bell rang the last warning of the day, many gathered to the sound of prayers, but others, with their eyes fixed on the stone ceiling, wondered in silence. What would life have been like out there? Would someone have waited for me? Would she have been loved as a woman and not as a martyr? Questions that dissolved into the darkness, and that, over time, they stopped being made, because silence, when repeated every day, becomes part of the skin. And the woman who once dreamed of freedom learns to dream of peace, and perhaps that is why, even today, in some ruins of ancient convent, the wind seems to carry whispers that no one understands. As if the walls held stories that were never spoken out loud, gifts that did not shine under the sun, but that still echo among the cold stones. Because offering silence as a gift is transforming absence into eternity. And in the end, these stories do not need answers. They just need to be heard, with the calm they deserve, with the respect that was never given to them in life. In some old houses, the bride and groom's room was the same one where the grandparents had slept, and before them, the great-grandparents. The wood of the floor creaked at the same spot where entire lives had begun and ended. The bed, almost always made of oak darkened by time, was the most precious gift a family could offer. But it wasn't just a gift. It was a sentence. Because within it came the stories, the secrets, and the weight of what was expected of a couple. There was no room for light dreams. Each fold of the sheet hid memories that did not belong to the person who was going to lie there for the first time. The bed was an inheritance, but it was also a testament. Mothers polished it with oil and silence. The parents, when giving her as a dowry, said nothing, but the steady gaze said it all. Fertility was expected there, companionship, resistance. It was like handing over a domestic altar, where the rights of life as a couple would be celebrated. There was a solemnity in his scent, a mix of old wood, lavender, and sleepless nights. The mattress, often filled with straw or feathers, creaked at the slightest movement, as if protesting, as if remembering that each gesture was observed by memory. For the bride, lying in that bed, was also lying on centuries of expectation. It was hearing echoes of past moans, of muffled fights, of reconciliations made under the same blanket. The bed was not just a place to rest. It was a testing ground. This was where the marriage was confirmed, where women were expected to be more than just wives. that it would be a foundation, that it was silence and surrender, even when the body was shaking with fear, even when the heart wanted to run away from there. And she, wrapped in thick linen sheets, looked at the ceiling and wondered where in the story her own voice fit. Some men feared the bed as much as women did, because it also demanded strength, constancy, and dominance from them. It was where masculinity was measured, and failure, unspoken, was felt like a chill under the skin. The bed, which should have been welcoming, sometimes suffocated, and while the bodies tried to get used to each other, the furniture creaked in protest, or in complicity. Time inside that room was slower, and the nights longer, because it was not easy to sleep where so many had already veiled their own fears. It was common for the bed to be passed down through generations, retired but never replaced, and each new bride who received it knew that she inherited more than one piece of furniture. I inherited stories that I couldn't question. Some left flowers under the pillow, others prayers sewn into the hem of the sheet. It was an attempt to lighten the load, to ask that wood, so ancient, to welcome your dreams with kindness, and sometimes it worked. Sometimes love blossomed there, between creaking boards and shadows that watched in silence. On festive days, the bed was displayed with pride. Visitors admired her. They played the carvings. They commented on his resistance. No one spoke of the woman who would sleep there. They were talking about the bed. She was the center, proof that that union had roots, that the family trusted that inheritance to keep everything going. But deep down, there was an unspoken question. What if the bed doesn't fit into this bride's dreams? What if, instead of shelter, it becomes a prison? These questions dissolved in the tea served in the afternoon, in the discreet smiles, in the words that did not cross the room. And even today, in some old houses, this bed remains, untouched, like a domestic monument. It carries the dust of the years, and perhaps it still holds in its silence the warmth of all those who dreamed, feared, loved and left them, because certain gifts cannot be measured, and a bed, when offered as a gift, is also a mirror of the one who offers it, of the one who receives it, and of everything that remains between the two, even when the rest of the house falls asleep. At first glance, it may seem strange, a bag of salt as a wedding gift, but there was a time when salt was not just a seasoning. It was wealth, it was power, it was survival. Carried in thick linen bags or clay pots sealed with wax, it arrived at ceremonies with silent respect. Offering it as a dowry was to say, here is something that preserves, that prevents rot, that resists time. It was a symbol, but also a tool, because life as a couple, like meat, needed something that would keep it firm for longer. The smell of salt was not sweet. It was dry, sharp. It stuck to your hands. It stayed on your clothes. It got into your eyes if the wind dared. But it was also a sign of stability. It preserved fish, cheese, and game. It was the difference between a bearable winter and imminent famine. So by giving it as a dowry, the bride's parents were saying, we give you the chance to last, the chance to resist, to remain whole, even when everything around you threatened to rot. And that was more than romantic. It was necessary. There were weddings where salt was discreetly sprinkled around the door of the new house, an ancient, almost magical gesture to ward off anything that could corrupt. No one spoke about it out loud, but everyone knew. It was a silent ritual inherited from generation, and when the bride saw that simple jar on the table, she understood. Married life would not be made up of affection alone, but of resistance, of patience, of constant effort so that the bond would not deteriorate. And like salt, love would have to infiltrate slowly, without fanfare, but deeply. Salt also served as a metaphor. It was what highlights, but also what corrodes. In excess, it destroyed. In the right measure, it supported. That was how the commitments were, and marriage often teetered between these two shores. There were days when the salt of life was shared laughter, warmth in the chest. In others, it was a tear that burned. And yet, both moments were part of the pact. Because true love is not measured only in sweet days, but in the ability to go through the bitterness together. Not every couple knew how to use this gift well. There were those who, out of fear, kept the sword locked away and let it harden into untouched blocks. Others used it too much, wanting to hasten the flavors of life, and ended up saturating everything around them. But there were also those who learned over time, who discovered the right balance between preserving and risking, between maintaining and renewing. These, yes, aged side by side, like well-cured food, whose essence became richer with each year. When the salt ran out, it was a sign that time had passed. And sometimes, at the time of death of one of the two, a small handful was still found safe, forgotten in a corner, maybe as a souvenir, maybe as a warning. It was as if to say, we were here, we resist, and now that one is gone, the other remains salty with memory. Because a love that lasted even without big parties, is a love worth remembering, and salt, with its cutting simplicity, was a witness to this feat. And so, to this day, some say that a good marriage needs a pinch of salt to add flavor, to cure the pain, to remember that everything that is preserved with affection lives longer. And even though today it comes in light packages from the supermarket, the symbolism remains. The commitment still weighs, but it also protects. And whoever carries it with care, as if it were an ancestral gift, may discover that love, even invisible, can be as essential as that which seasons food and life. And when thought was not enough, when the promise of resistance was not enough to seal the fate of two strangers, other currencies entered the scene, some with big eyes and woolly meekness. The dowry then came in the form of a sheep, not just anyone, but the one that had won local competitions, or that had wool softer than the finest linen. In times of scarcity, she was a treasure. And there were stories of entire marriages being made because of a single animal. At first glance, it might seem strange, but for those who knew the value of good wool, it was like receiving a fortune. The sheep was decorated, a red bow on its neck. Dried petals were glued between the folds of its wool. It was presented with the same pride that an expensive wedding ring is presented today. Sometimes there was a parade. The bride walked behind the animal, and everyone knew that there was more to it than just a symbolic exchange. There was calculation. There was hope. The bride's father looked at the groom and said, without words, she comes with plenty, and the groom, by accepting, was taking on more than just a marriage. He was taking on the care of a possession that could clothe, warm, and feed. The sheep was all of these things. There was also the belief that the softness of the wool was a reflection of the harmony that would come. If the wool woven well, the marriage would also weave sweetly. Some women kept the threads stored in wooden boxes, like relics from the beginning of everything. Others made blankets, trousseaux, pieces that lasted a lifetime. And there were those who simply let the sheep graze next to the house as a living witness to the choice made. The neighbors, hearing the soft bleating in the evening, smiled. It was a sound that sealed, day after day, the continuity of that home. But not all marriages sealed by sheep brought peace. Sometimes the wool hid thorns. The groom, chosen for his skillful hands with animal, knew little about tenderness. Or the bride, silent, looked at the animal with more affection than she could offer the man at her side. In these houses, the sheep was a shadow, remembrance of a pact made with more interest than desire. And his bleating seemed, in time, to carry a tone of melancholy, as if she also knew that she had been used to buy something that could not be measured. Yet there was beauty. When well cared for, the sheep reciprocates. Its presence brings rhythm. It grazes in the morning, rests in the evening, and allows itself to be sheared patiently. It is predictable, and so it brings comfort. For women who come from unstable homes, this animal represents stability, a cycle, a thread of continuity in a life marked by uncertainty. And so, some brides, even without immediate love for their husbands, find love in the peaceful repetition of the days. The literal exchange between an animal and a man might seem absurd today, but, in its own way, it was an agreement with nature, an alliance where care was central. If he knew how to care for the sheep, perhaps he would know how to care for her too. And the sheep, with its ever-wet eyes and calm breathing, became a symbol of a beginning, of a promise, of a coexistence that, even without passion, could turn into affection. And even today, at certain rural festivals, sheep are still decorated with flowers, as a reminder of those times, no longer to sell them for husbands, but as a memory, as a gentle echo of a time when love could come covered in wool. And the future bleated in the distance, asking only for care, and perhaps for a little silent tenderness. And when neither salt nor wool, nor the inherited bed were enough, there were families who preferred to hide their love under the ground. Literally, in some regions, the dowry was buried. Ancient coins, small treasures, pieces of silver wrapped in thick cloth. The gesture was secret, almost ritualistic. The bride's father would choose a piece of land, and, at night, with no witnesses other than the stars, would dig a shallow grave. There, he placed his daughter's future. It wasn't meant for anyone to see. It was meant for someone to find one day. Dig if you commit. This act of hiding wealth was also a symbol of trust and of fear. People trusted in the earth, in the memory of those who knew where to dig, and in the destiny of those who deserved to find it. But there was also a shadow in this gesture, a way of saying that love needed to be sought, that the commitment did not come easily, nor was it visible. The buried dowry carried the weight of the invisible. It was a silent promise. It was a disguised demand. It was a test. And whoever got married under these conditions started their life with their knees covered in dirt. There were ceremonies in which the groom received only a vague indication. One side of the yard, a type of stone, a sign, and he dug, in silence, in respect. With each shovel of earth removed, the rush was also buried, because this was no ordinary excavation. It was a symbolic gesture. It was an entry into another time, a time when one proved one's worth not with words, but with sweat. And when, finally, the fingertips touched the damp cloth or the cool edge of a box, the silence became bliss. The bride often did not witness the moment. I stayed at home, waiting, wondering if he would find it, and even more, whether he would understand. Because it wasn't the treasure that mattered. It was the willingness to seek, to kneel before the earth and say, I am ready to begin. Not as sir, but as a part, as someone who also plants, also waits, also waters. The buried dowry thus became a metaphor for love that demands depth, that does not show everything at once, that invites slow care. But there were also sad stories, of dowries that were not found, of failed digs, of brides who never knew where or what their parents hid. And these marriages began with holes not only in the ground, but in the heart. Because it is not enough to want to find. You have to know how to look. And not everyone has the eyes for that. Some bury too much. Others dig without delicacy. And what could be a jewel becomes a ruin. Yet this practice persisted for centuries. And in many old yards, there are still legends of coins under the fig tree, or of boxes hidden under the largest stone in the garden. Even if there is no more love to accompany them, even if no one else gets married in that house, the dowry remains there as a reminder of what was promised, of what was asked in exchange for a life, and the faith one had in the future, even when it was covered by layers of silence. And perhaps, in this gesture of burying riches, there was also a request for love to come from below, to grow invisibly, to only blossom after a long time, like roots, like everything that really mattered. And when finally it appeared on the surface, it would bring with it the certainty that it had been sought after with care, found with merit, and never forgotten. After burying so many secrets and waiting for love to blossom from the ground, there were those who preferred to celebrate right away on the surface, with food, with the sound of pots and pans and the aroma of spices lingering in the air. In some ancient cultures, the dowry came in the form of a banquet, a lavish table, set with care, as if to say, here is my daughter, and here is everything she deserves. Marriage, then, began before the touch of hands. It began with chewing, with serving, with tasting, and love often was dessert. The clinking of glasses was a sign of blessing. The slow-cooked meats, the dried fruits mixed with honey, the freshly baked bread, all of this spoke louder than the vows. When the bride's father offered the banquet, he was not just offering food. He was offering work, abundance, generosity. And he expected, in return, that the groom would recognize it, that he would feel, in every bite, the weight of that choice, that he would not be just a hungry man, but someone capable of feeding in return. Because love there was also cooking. The guests knew what that banquet meant. They looked at the dishes with attentive eyes. They evaluated the seasonings, not by taste, but by symbol. The more elaborate the dish, the more valuable the bride. And there were silent rules. No one served too much. No food was allowed to get cold. And no one began to eat before the groom's eyes met the bride's. It was a game of looks and gestures, where love was not spoken, but served in discreet portion, one spoonful at a time. Some banquets were prepared for weeks. Other times, they were improvised with what they had. But even in the simplest, there was an almost sacred delicacy. The bride's mother kneaded the bread with the hands that had rocked her when she was little. The aunts picked herbs from the backyard with the smell of childhood and care. And the bride, even without cooking, was in everything, on every side, in each fold of the towel. She was, symbolically, the main dish, not in the sense of possession, but of sharing. There was also a whispered saying among the older women, a marriage that begins with hunger ends with fighting, and maybe it was true, because eating together, in the beginning, was a way of practicing living together. To accept others with their cutlery, their manners, their tastes. It was, at times, more intimate than the bed, more revealing than the altar. And when the groom licked his fingers after the last piece of meat, some smiles broke out. It was a sign that everything was starting well. But there were weddings where the banquet was excessive, a show-off, an attempt to disguise the lack of affection with an abundance of food. And in these cases, the abundance turned into noise. The table, a wall. The dowry, a distraction. Words were eaten. Silences were swallowed. And when the guests left, what was left were dirty plates. And two strangers sitting at an empty table. Because not every banquet feeds what matters. And yet, to this day, there is something magical about starting a union with a hot dish. Because food brings us together, heat up, invites you to stay. And even in the times when you didn't marry for love, there was always that moment when bread was broken. And there, perhaps unintentionally, a kind of affection began.
A way of saying, I'm here.
Hungry, but also wanting to stay.
To prove, to take care of. And even after the banquets, the bags of salt, the trees and sheep, there were gifts that could not be seen. Gifts that were not on the table, nor on the surface.
They hovered between glances, between silences that spanned generations. They were stories whispered behind half-open doors, and that shaped marriages without ever being said out loud. In many cases, the heaviest dowry was precisely the one that was not given with the hands, but that was hidden behind the mother's gaze, in the father's handshake.
It was the secret, the absence, what was not named. There were marriages formed out of emotional debt.
Alliances sealed by loyalty to an unresolved past. When two families came together not out of desire, but out of necessity to heal wounds, the daughter then was the bridge, the symbolic currency that redeemed old mistakes.
And the groom, often, didn't even know.
I just felt a different weight at the altar.
An invisible presence between the two, as if something was watching them, demanding that they stay together, not for love,
but by right.
In these houses, everything seemed in order, but the air was thick,
the furniture too immobile.
The bride smiled with her lips, but the smile did not reach her eyes.
She carried more than just the dress.
He carried the memory of something he did not choose, of a promise made before he was even born. And yet, he continued,
I helped set up the house.
I made the bread. I fixed the sheets. But inside it, there was a place that didn't move.
A place where the invisible dowry hid, like a root that finds no sun.
Sometimes this secret came in the form of a name never mentioned, from a torn letter, from a portrait hidden at the bottom of the drawer. The groom realized, over time, that there was something there.
Something that wasn't his, but was now part of his everyday life. It was a delicate but constant ghost,
and he learned to live with it,
respecting that silence that wasn't his, but that now inhabited the same bed, the same cutlery, the same gesture of turning on the light. And there were days when the secret almost came undone,
when the bride looked at her husband as if she wanted to tell him, but I couldn't.
Because the invisible dowry was also protection. If revealed, perhaps everything would fall apart.
So she kept it, and time passed, and that secret, previously uncomfortable, became part of the marriage.
Like a crack that we learned to ignore.
Like an old perfume that, even though it's not ours, no longer bothers us. But there was also beauty in this type of union, because even without clarity, there was care. Even with shadows, there were gestures of affection.
And this taught something, that love is not always born from what is said,
but from what is sustained despite what is not said.
That there are bonds that do not need to be explained to be strong.
And that, sometimes silence is more eloquent than 1,000 words.
Today, when we talk about dowry, we think about goods. But there are entire marriages built on what is left unsaid, about silent promises, about unsigned inherited pacts.
And these, when held gently, also flourish.
They also last.
Even when the secret remains there, quiet, sitting at the table, listening without being heard,
accompanying without getting in the way,
as only ancient secrets know how to do.
And if the invisible dowry was a secret hidden from view, there were also those that manifested themselves in strange forms,
small,
almost imperceptible from a distance, but dense as an ancient whisper.
In Victorian times, for example, one of the most intimate gifts someone could give was a ring, not studded with stones, but braided with strands of human hair.
At first, it may feel uncomfortable, but for many, it was poetry in the form of matter.
Hair, after all, grows silently, carries memories. It touches everything we are. It was common for the bride to carefully braid her own hair and perfume it with lavender oils.
Then, he rolled them into gentle loops until they formed a ring, a continuous circle.
Like the vows he made, like the time you wanted to share. Sometimes the gift was delivered with a short, handwritten note, so intimate it was almost illegible, and the groom, upon receiving it, felt like he was in front of something alive, not a cold jewel, but an extension of the woman he loved.
A part of it.
Literally. The ring's touch was rough,
different from polished gold. He scraped the skin gently and firmly,
as a constant reminder that love also requires adaptation.
And the aroma that came from the threads, lavender, jasmine, sometimes even cinnamon, gently enveloped her fingers, as if the bride's presence was there. Even though she was absent, it was a gesture that dispensed with riches.
Who said, "This is the most mine I have," at a time when women could barely sign their own names. Offering their hair was a way of making their presence felt.
To say, I am.
Not everyone understood this gesture.
Many found it strange,
even morbid. But there were those who saw a deep connection there, as if the ring stitched lives together with invisible ties. And in a way, it did.
Some were kept for decades.
Others were buried next to the body of the loved one.
There were those who swore they felt warmth when touching them, as if the threads still pulsed with memory,
as if they held words that were never said.
but there was also anguish, because, like everything that is alive, hair rots, and over time, the rings fell apart.
The weaves lost their shape. The threads came loose, creating little knots.
It was love being reminded that it is also material.
That it also is out. That it needs to be cared for.
Many tried to preserve the gift, sealing it in small glass urns, away from humidity, away from time.
But sooner or later, nature took its toll, and the ring turned to dust.
Still, the gesture endured, because more than the object, it was the intention that touched.
It was the act of offering something intimate, visceral, eternal in its fragility. And even today, amidst the modernity of the world, there are those who miss this kind of surrender.
Of a love that materializes in something simple,
That doesn't shine, but pulsates.
that doesn't cost much, but demands courage, because giving your hair is not giving beauty. It is giving roots. It is saying, this grew with me.
And now it grows with you.
And perhaps that is why some of these rings are still kept in forgotten drawers, inside velvet boxes, among yellowed letters and faded pictures,
Not as a reminder of a gift.
but as a reminder of a time when love was also weaving.
And the strand of hair, like the thread of destiny, connected two people in silence.
With sweetness, with strangeness, with eternity.
After so many exchanges, so many bags of salt, fruit trees, and inherited silences, there was a type of dowry that was surprising in its absence.
A dowry that did not come in the form of an object, animal or secret, but which, for that very reason, was the rarest and most valuable.
It was the dowry of freedom. Marriages in which the gift was simply nothing but one's own desire.
No condition, no demands, no promises made by others.
Just to people saying yes, not because of inheritances or agreement, but by mutual choice. This type of union was viewed with suspicion. What do you mean? You got married without a dowry? Whispered the neighbors. It seemed bold, immature,
But for those involved, it was lightness.
it was walking without weight in your pockets, without the shadow of other people's expectations, just looking at each other, and the courage to build together what came next.
No map, no guarantees.
Just the wind in your hair and the ground beneath your feet,
The beginning there was sincere, and for that very reason, fragile.
but also possible.
There were families who did not accept it. Parents who saw the lack of a dowry as a sign of disrespect, as if love, in order to be valid, needed to come wrapped in object.
But there were also parents who understood,
Who saw the absence of demands as the purest form of trust.
and who, silently, wished that this couple, even with nothing in their hands, would have everything in their hearts.
Because, at the end of the day, freedom is also an inheritance.
And giving freedom to a son or daughter is a gesture of greatness that few can perform.
Marriages without a dowry were often smoother.
Not for lack of challenges, but for lack of ghost. The bride and groom did not have to honor other people's legacies.
They did not have to sleep on old beds or dig for coins under the garden. They started from scratch, and in that scratch there was a whole world.
It was like entering an empty house, with open windows and curtains dancing in the wind. A space to be filled, an invitation to see a creation.
And every gesture, every object, every memory built there was theirs.
Only theirs. But the gift of freedom also came with risks.
Because, without roots, love could fly. It could disperse at the slightest whiff of disagreement. There were no guarantees.
Only the present, and that required attention, presence.
Daily care. Like a candle lit on a windy night. It required listening. It required welcoming. It required growing together.
And those who understood this made freedom a bond, not a knot.
But a light bond that holds without tightening, that unites without suffocating.
These couples, over time, began to be remembered not for what they had, but for what they built. The houses, modest or not, carried an aura of authenticity.
The children grew up seeing their parents look at each other with true affection.
There were no dowries to inherit.
But there were stories. There was comfortable silence.
There was respect. And that, perhaps, was worth more than any orchard or old mattress. Because freedom, when cared for by two, becomes shelter. And shelter is all a love needs to last. And so, we conclude this journey through the most curious, symbolic, silent, and sometimes strange gifts that history has kept.
From trees to hair, from secrets to banquets.
Each gift carried a world. But sometimes, the most valuable gift is precisely not needing any.
It is being able to say, I choose you, without currency,
Without exchange.
only with a clean heart. and the desire to walk alongside, wherever the road leads.
And now that the voices of the past are slowly beginning to fade, like candles that are extinguished by the breeze, perhaps only a feeling remains.
That love, at any time, has always been more than a gesture.
It was a promise, it was delivery, it was also silence.
And sometimes a little invention. Whether it's an orchard or a prayer, a creaking pit or a decorated sheep, each story reminds us that behind the objects, the rituals, the gifts, there have always been people trying to connect, trying to find something in the other that makes sense to continue. If these stories touch you in any way, well, there are many more waiting to be whispered. So, if you want to hear more of these soft and strange memories that history hides, you know where to find me.
I'll be here, as always.
And only if you want, of course. Consider subscribing and liking this video. This helps the channel to continue existing, but only if it makes sense to you. Only if this corner is truly a place where you want to rest more often.
By the way, tell me in the comments, where did you hear me from today? And what time is it there? I like to imagine this invisible map that we built together, night after night, made of points of light lit in silent rooms, spread across the world.
Each one with their own story.
Each one with their own quest.
And now, united by these quiet narratives that help us slow down.
Maybe you're lying down with your eyes closed.
Or maybe you're just listening as you finish something from your day.
Either way, I thank you for letting me into your night, for trusting these minutes of your attention to these forgotten but still living stories.
Stories that, even though they're old, know how to keep you company.
And that, deep down, still speak of us. So now, dim the lights.
Maybe turn on an amber lamp or turn the fan on the softest setting.
Let the white noise lull your thoughts.
And if you want, close your eyes. You don't have to understand it all anymore.
Just feel it.
The world outside can wait a little.
Inside, everything is calm. Everything is okay. Good night.
And until the next story.